Welcome to the second section where we would like to focus on discouraging demand. And I would, because we are a bit late, so I continue immediately with to introduce the keynote speaker, or Mike Dottridge, who will introduce into the topic, and then we have two commentators. We have Roger Blunt. He's an independent expert now, but years ago he was the head of the ILO Special Action Program to combat forced labor, and at that time, quite some years ago, we focused, ILO also focused for the first time on human trafficking. And we have Noemi Magugliani. She is a research fellow in anti-trafficking law and policy at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. And we imagine that we have a short introduction by Mike and the two commentators, and afterwards, for the same issue, we have the panel. Yeah, this is what we have afterwards. So I give immediately no, just wait a moment. You will have the floor, but I would like to mention Mike's quote. He said, "Anti-prostitution campaigners have been keen to define this issue," meaning the issue of demand, "as their own, as though all commercial sex involves trafficking." And his conclusion is that therefore a more rigorous approach is needed to identify measures to discourage demand, and demand, of course, not only for sexual exploitation, but for all sorts of products and services that involve people who have been trafficked, and also not only for women, but as he points out, men and boys, as well as women and girls. So Mike, now it's your turn.
Thank you, Helga. As you say, this session is going to talk about what some lobbyists and policymakers see as the great white hope of preventing human trafficking. Now, my fear is that the concept of discouraging demand is like a different metaphor. It's rather like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I don't know whether in your different languages you see the rainbow with the marvelous gold at the end of it. No one ever obtains the gold, but we all would like to think it's there. And I've been worried that the repeated efforts, either from the US State Department, this year from the OSCE, to focus attention on discouraging demand simply when trafficking is for the purpose of the exploitation of prostitution, I'm worried that this has had the effect of sidelining prevention methods that are much more likely to bring swifter and bigger benefits. But once again, today our focus is on principles that should help, not just methods. And not only principles that are relevant to discouraging demand in the context of the commercial sex industry, but rather ones that would be relevant, for example, to us living in the United Kingdom, to know what to discourage when it comes to young people from Vietnam who come all the way to England to work as secret gardeners cultivating cannabis. Or in a different example, when the purpose of trafficking is to transplant body organs from trafficking victims to prolong the lives of richer, aging people. And in both cases, I know that there are highly effective prevention methods that could be deployed, but are not. Now, when I and others gave advice to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2002 on what became some principles and guidelines on human rights and human trafficking, I supported this notion that something meaningful could be done about demand. And we reckoned it was essential to give attention to the factors that generate demand for exploitative commercial sexual services and exploitative labor. In large part, this was because of the predatory behavior I'd observed among foreign soldiers deployed in various parts of Africa, along with what I was hearing at the turn of the century from an area I knew in what is now called the Congo, the exploitation of adults and child workers in artisanal mines in Kivu. This was an area where foreign armies were competing to get control of the production and export of cassiterite, an essential mineral in the manufacture of the mobile phone in your pocket or your bag today. So I've thought about the issue, and I've thought a bit about some principles, and we've ended up with 8 principles, quite a lot, to guide initiatives taken to discourage demand. But these are supplemented by another more general one concerning business and human rights, and the way in which a business that takes appropriate action can affect the behavior of other businesses as well as consumers, other businesses that it either buys from or it sells to. A final note is that I've listened to a lot of debates about the issue of demand that have been just a stale repetition of 2 contrasting views. One side calling for demand for commercial sex in general to be eradicated, and the other side complaining that measures to discourage demand constitute an attack on sex workers' rights. That is to say, sex workers who have not been trafficked and want to earn a living. If measures to influence demand are only considered in the context of closing the commercial sex sector, I fear we are missing a very valuable opportunity to prevent all sorts of extreme exploitation in other industries, varying in my experience from Thailand's seafood sector to garment workers in virtually every continent and live-in domestic workers here in Europe and elsewhere. So I wish you a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much. Mike, yeah, we continue immediately with Roger Plant. His focus is on labor exploitation.
Yeah. Helga, thank you very much for inviting me. I missed the last 2 years here, so it's a real pleasure to be back again in person in Vienna next to my good friend, Mike Dottridge. I'm not very good at breaking things down into component parts of prevention demand. I prefer to look at the big picture here. I'm not going to talk about sexual exploitation. I'm talking about demand for cheap labor. I'm also going to follow up what Helmut Sachs was saying earlier on. He said we need to talk about sort of preventing exploitation. The problem is this is a huge, huge area, and it's going to be very difficult to reach consensus as to what constitutes the different forms of exploitation. What is criminal exploitation? What are the lesser forms of exploitation? When I was dealing with this issue, so I used to be what I call an anti-slavery and anti-trafficking globetrotter going everywhere. For the last 3 years, I've been sitting mainly in London, just reading from time to time about the major events on the international scene. But some of the news I've been seeing has been very telling. Mike has already referred to the latest global estimate of 50 million people in forced labor and forced marriage. This was my old organization, the ILO, together with the Walk Free Foundation and the IOM. I was responsible for coordinating the first global estimate on forced labor in 2005. Our figures were 12.3 million people in forced labor. So it's 4 times as much. It's absolutely massive. Over 17 years, we're now seeing a 400% increase in the problem. So this is hardly a sign of progress or effective commitment to preventing the problems and abuses. And I'd now like to go closer to home, my own country. The UK, we've referred to it sometimes. It's often prided itself on its legislative and institutional initiatives to eradicate these coercive practices. And the centerpiece has been the 2015 Modern Slavery Act. Another institutional measure, widely known, was the creation of an anti-slavery commissioner, who's basically a sort of advisory watchdog for the government as well as a publicist. But what have been the effects of this? I happened to open the London Times a couple of years ago, on August the 18th this year, and saw an article headed "Thousands of Slavery Cases Unsolved." And the UK government Home Office figures indicated that only 1 in 50 cases of modern slavery reported to the police last year led to a suspect even being charged. And in over half of these cases, the police just closed the case because of evidential difficulties. So having tremendous problems, and this is something which has always concerned me ever since I started working seriously on this over 20 years ago, is this fantastic mismatch between the estimates of forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery, and law enforcement. And I think as one politician from an opposition party has recently said, the hostile environment immigration policies make it harder for victims to come forward basically let slavery off the hook. And when cases are identified, it's nearly always small operators. I was looking at the recent reports of the Gang Masters Labor and Abuse Authority. This is the GLLA. This is the organization which was established in its present form 5 years ago to investigate labor offences in England and Wales. And really, a review of its communications over the past year suggests that almost all of the so-called offenders have been very small offenders of East European origin, and most of the victims have also been of East European origin in small industries such as car washing. So, but today, I think, the facts and the shortcomings are pretty much the same as they were when I started working this two decades ago. It's inadequate, ambiguous legislation, weak law enforcement, limited public consciousness as to the reality of the conditions endured, and a lack of real political will or commitment by business actors to address the various forms of subcontracting and recruitment that paved the way for abuses. I noticed Mike was referring to the shortcomings of what was an attempt to create a fair recruitment initiative to really bring all the actors together to try to find some common ground for moving forward. But I was glad when I was preparing for this, I just looked at the GLA, the Gangmasters website, and I saw that next week they will be holding a webinar to discuss the shortcomings of so-called umbrella companies and what to do about them. As I think you will know, the umbrella companies, these are those which generally employ contractors working on short-term assignments and acting as intermediaries between contractors and the end employers and agencies. And the webinar will be jointly hosted by the GLAA, together with the government agencies responsible for employment rights and tax fraud. I would say that at a global level, things are moving forward very, very slowly, at a snail's pace. But at the national level, we really need to find joint initiatives to promote measures which will compel companies to act, failing which they will lose at least some of their profits and business advantage. Criminal law enforcement of anti-slavery and trafficking laws, while always needing to be part of the picture, is by no means the only one and may not be the most important one. We must have severe financial penalties for tax fraud and avoidance, confiscations of licenses, and in the worst case, compulsory closure of enterprises. And these have to be part of the armory against slavery and slavery-like practices in the modern economy. So I say that's looking at demand in a slightly different way. But I do agree that we need to go right back to the drawing board and look at what are these factors, what are the institutional failures and mechanisms which need to be built up in order to move a little bit further forward than 20 years ago. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We are, with the panel afterwards, we will further discuss this. Thank you very much. Most important, because in your quote, you spoke about an adequately funded enforcement mechanism. So maybe later on we can discuss how such an enforcement mechanism should work, and who would have to initiate it, who would be part, who should be part of that. So this is for the panel, and hopefully you can get involved in this discussion. So I come now to the second commentator, which is Noemi Magogliani. As I said, she is a research fellow at the British Institute for International and Comparative Law. And in her quote, she said the combination of discriminatory laws and policies and a state's tolerance of so-called legal black holes, which facilitate rather than discourage demand, ought to be considered, analyzed, and framed as tools of state-sponsored vulnerability. I like this expression, because this is really the fact, state-sponsored vulnerability that are in direct contrast with the principle of good faith. Let me just add that you are also the advisor, among many duties you have, but the advisor to the current rapporteur, UN rapporteur on trafficking in persons, especially women and children. This is the successor to Maria Grazia Giammarinaro, who was very often with us discussing these issues. So please, you have the floor for your comments.
Thank you very much for the invitation, the kind introduction, and the opportunity to have, I think, a very critical discussion, and not one that is prescriptive, but that is constructive in terms of where we're going towards. And there is a couple of elements in the context of demand that I would like to sort of merge between the conversation that happened earlier today on prevention and the nature of prevention. So similarly, what is the nature of demand? And sometimes it appears, or it seems, at least to me, that this emphasis on discouraging demand is the nth mechanism or way that certain states put in place to shift responsibility. And the responsibilities shift towards individuals, private companies, businesses, other states, third parties, trafficked persons, and something that's outside or that's not part of the state. So it's this delegation of blame or responsibility or ownership of obligations, which at the end of the day still rest on the state. And in my mind, again, when I think of the nature of demand, I always think about the structure or the system in which that demand exists. So if a state has an obligation, not only due diligence as a principle, but also an obligation to implement international law in good faith, it means that the entirety of a state's action have to reflect that principle. So that if a state operates in a certain way with respect to reducing or discouraging demand when it comes to private entities or individuals, it ought to do the same when it comes to the actions of the state. And I was very happy to see that in the principles, this is actually mentioned quite in detail. And there is an emphasis on structural elements, systematic elements that goes beyond what we're almost used to know when it comes to discouraging demand. Be that even more so because what we're used to know pretty much encompasses only certain types of demands, as Mike mentioned earlier. So I guess the point that I would really like to see unpacked a bit more is the point on the fact that demand is structural and contextual, to cite in a way, Kirill, and the contextual element that you mentioned earlier. And it is particular, and it cannot be discouraged through particular measures when the broader measures create an environment when demand is facilitated. Be that because exploitation is tolerated, be that because on the one hand we're discouraging a particular type of demand, maybe in a particular sector, but there are laws and policies that tolerate demand elsewhere or create the conditions where the first demand can happen. So these interconnections, I think, are quite important to bear in mind when we talk about demand. And there are a few questions to me when it comes to state action in addressing demand. And one is, where are we discouraging demand? Where is the state doing that? There is surely an internal dimension. So a state might say, I'm discouraging demand within my jurisdiction, and I'm taking actions internally. what about the effect that that has on demand externally? So again, the interconnection between internal and external dimension, between even a very local approach or a statewide approach, those are different. So when we talk about discouraging demand, always the question that I have at least is where, of what, and for whom? So which demand are we talking about? Which I think is another quite intricate question, but one that we should absolutely bear in mind. And just to go back to and close on the idea of due diligence and good faith, in every action, not only within demand, but across the board, there has to be consistency and there has to be harmony. Because otherwise the risk is that we have good or positive actions somewhere combined with negative actions elsewhere, or negative repercussions, or collateral damage, or however you want to call it, whether it's conscious or not, that end up in a zero-sum game. So that's money spent on prevention, and money spent on protection, and money spent on discouraging demand. And at the same time, it's almost like we're investing money to fix the collateral damage that we didn't take into account in the first place. So the idea of always looking, yes, locally, yes, contextually, but looking at every potential outcome or implication of any effort and what that means. So I think that I would just close there for now, but hoping to have a fruitful discussion later.
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, it shows that there's much to do, you know, and it's also complex, yeah, really complex and complicated, but nevertheless important. And we will continue now with the panel, and then maybe you can come in again and comment on a few things. Could we make a quick shift? And I would like to ask Olaf Legdene to come to the podium, Daya Wenke, Gabriela Bottani, and last but not least, Susanne Hoff. I would like to start with Susanne Hoff. She is the international coordinator of La Strada International, and of course with a long experience, and we always rely also on their work, you know, and their experience really in the fight against human trafficking. And this time, I mean, there is much to say, but this time we would like to focus on demand and on your, let's say, also your concern, you know, that changes, envisaged changes at EU level would go in the wrong direction. So could you a bit elaborate on that?
Thank you very much, Helga, also for inviting me again to your think tank discussions. Yeah, we heard already a lot about demand, also from the other speakers. I would like to come immediately to what we heard earlier today, also from Deanne Smith, that there is currently the evaluation of the anti-trafficking directive. And she mentioned it might not be fit for purpose. It's already existing for 10 years. And I would like very much also to refer to what Peter said earlier. I mean, that argumentation is a bit odd if we know that there's other legislation which is much older. And secondly, there has been a lot of evaluations done. And the conclusions, including from the EU own reports, progress reports, they always are exactly the same. It lacks the implementation, and that's also for other EU law. However, so as La Strada International, we were not very much in favor to have a revision of the directive. Of course, if it's coming, we will definitely see how we can have it improved and also look at the different provisions. And what we know is that, as she also mentioned, but that she will present it in December, on 13th of December, and then we will hear what exactly the legislative changes are. What Deanne Smith did not say, and what is maybe not known, but I think to most people it is known, is that the main push for this evaluation of the directive is because people want indeed to change Article 18.4 on demand, and to make it a criminal offense in all EU member states as a binding offense, to criminalize the knowingly use of the services that are, that foster exploitation. And first of all, yeah, we are a little bit doubting about that needed push, as we already heard from Mike and from others, that the focus related to criminalizing the knowingly use has always been completely on the sex industry and on criminalizing the clients of sex workers, either sometimes in some countries also criminalizing sex workers or other parts of the industry. But yeah, what we feel, so that's first of all what we do not agree with. But also what we think is a bit funny is that because of that push, and to have the directive also revised because of that, is also that there's actually at this moment no proof that it has any impact and any positive impact. We spoke already about the harm, and we see actually more harm to be done than effective impact. We started, but we just recently started, so for about 1 month, we started to do some interviews with experts in different countries. We wanted to look which countries already criminalized the knowingly use of the services that foster exploitation. And we also looked at, who could tell us more, and also what the impact are. And it's, for us, already quite shocking when we spoke with different people. First of all, we spoke really with high-level experts, even prosecutors and others. And first of all, what was, to me, shocking at least, is that there's so limited knowledge about it. So people could hardly tell us if there was any prosecution related to the criminal act in their country. Also, people were not really clear which things could be criminalized under it, which services. In general, you see that the countries who have it, including the Netherlands, Austria, Germany, they've only criminalized it, only criminalized the knowingly use by clients of sex workers. And not all the forms. Bulgaria and Romania, for example, broaden it, but then also again you see there are hardly no cases if we look at the other forms. So next to that, there's hardly no knowledge, and the interpretation is so different, how we look at it. We also see there's general lack of awareness, even among those who are maybe to be criminalized. And we ask in all the countries we spoke to, and we have now spoken to about 8 or 9 countries, and in none of the countries, when, at least what we know, in none of the countries where this became a criminal offense, there was any awareness done, or at least no one who we spoke with was aware of any awareness campaign that you could be criminalized for this. So that's already what worries us, because we criminalize something and maybe those who might be criminalized are not aware, and I think at least people should be aware. Next to the different interpretation, what we also were concerned about is that this measure to criminalize the use of services that foster exploitation and thus human trafficking were seen to enhance the prosecution of human trafficking. And that's a very major argument that is being used. Now we heard already in the other panels that actually prosecution lags behind. And it's also very difficult that if you have to prove the criminalizing, to prove the use of the services of a trafficked person, then we think, and we also asked that question, you still have to prove trafficking. And we know already how difficult it is to prove trafficking. So then we doubt also what's then the added value if you still have to prove trafficking before you can prove the knowingly use of the services of a trafficked person. So speaking about that, we asked all the people, and the report is probably to come out in October, we hope, at least before the Commission will announce their measures on the 13th of December. We also asked from all the different stakeholders, including those who were in favor, for example, the Dutch former rapporteur Corine Detmeijer. We asked them all, what do you expect of this offense? And interesting thing is that they all said we only expect a normative impact. We expect people to become more aware and not to commit this crime, instead of that we expect any prosecution, which then of course already comes back to the question, will it then lead to more prosecutions on human trafficking? Also, all the people we spoke to had very strong doubts about the enforceability. And we heard actually from some people that they said already clearly this will not have a priority. A prosecutor from Romania told us, like, yeah, we have so many trafficking cases and so many international trafficking cases that we have to follow, that we have to try to get prosecuted. It would not be a priority for us to ensure that someone is making use of the services is prosecuted. There were already mentioning by several of the speakers before about the negative impact, and Mike also said it, like all the focus is on demand, and I think I liked very much also your question, which demand we are addressing, because that's a question we can discuss for days, and I think no one has the answer yet, because at least people think differently about it. But what we know is that there's always a very strong focus on sex workers. And we have also seen from numerous reports that the strong focus on sex workers and on any criminalization related to sex workers, even though sex workers themselves are not criminalized, that it has a negative impact and that increases the violence and exploitation of sex workers. So that's already a very negative impact also of this article. But what we also think, and then comes also to what you said earlier and when you introduced me, we also see some dangerous impact. Not only because there's also a big push from people now to leave out the word knowingly. And that actually comes from the OSCE, ODIHR, but also the Office of the Special Representative, also people from the EU Parliament, including the chair of the LIBE Committee, and we also see it from abolitionist groups, and they want the word knowingly out. That means that everyone could be liable who commits a crime without knowing that he or she committed the crime, but also this person might not have had the intention to commit the crime. And we think that's very dangerous. Also, if the Commission would really follow its own directive and says that this demand should address all the forms and indeed not only focus on sexual exploitation, but look really at all the forms, then we also wonder, and I mean, none of the people we spoke to could really answer this, would we then be criminalized ourselves if we buy products from Italy, for example, from agriculture, or from Spain? Or would we, if we have someone who repairs our roof, and this person is actually exploited, well, we did not know, could we then be liable and also follow this strict liability for consumers for someone who provided a service to us while we did not know and we were not intending to exploit them? So we think that's very dangerous. To conclude, so we think it's very dangerous also because which sector in Europe has not exploitative practices at the moment? It's very difficult, I think, for us as consumers, if we buy something, what is safe to buy, what is fair to buy, and I think that's actually one of the major reasons why all the states focus only on the sex industry, because it's simpler, because they also know it's not realistic to look at all the different forms and all the sectors, and maybe they are also afraid that they would be criminalized themselves. So that's why we think it would be a bit silly if in next year the directive will be changed on this article without us having further assessment, without us having further discussion. What would it mean in practice? Because you already see with the current EU legislation how interpretation is so different by the different member states. But if we have no guidance, what would fall under this? Then I think it can be very careful, because then maybe some services and some people are to be criminalized and others not. And we actually have also similar doubts with the ban on products, which we actually like as a very good initiative. But we also are afraid that, for example, with that new import ban on products, it could become a very political instrument that we, for example, start to refuse products from, let's say, from China, but not from Italy. And also what we see already, what's lacking in the due diligence legislation, but also in the ban on products, there's absolutely no notion of what's happening with the workers' rights, how are workers compensated if products or services are banned. So there's a lot of need for further discussion before we revise the directive. I leave it here.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think it's most interesting also for all of us, you know, to hear all the aspects, really. And let me just mention for those who are not so familiar with La Strada International, I mean, this is not just one NGO. It's a platform of, I think, how many? In 26 countries, yeah? Yeah, so these are NGOs really dealing with this, and I think it's a real important issue. And but many of what you said, you know, it's important also to know what's going on in practice. Yeah, so of course I come immediately, you know, to Olaf Legdene. He's from Norway. They live and work for 15 years, yeah, around 15 years with the so-called Nordic model, you know, which criminalizes the purchase of sex, and we would like to hear from you your experience. And you, the special thing is that you have worked with prostitutes on the one hand, and also with victims of sex trafficking. Yeah, and let me just quote or mention your quote. You said, "Practical experience shows that the so-called Nordic model, this is the law prohibiting the purchase of sexual services, introduced in Norway with a view to reduce the prostitution market and to change attitudes towards prostitution, does not have the often claimed effect to prevent human trafficking." And you added the question, could it actually be the opposite? Yeah, this is what we would like to know and to hear from you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Helga. The Church City Mission in Oslo provides services in the areas of prostitution and human trafficking and exploitation in labor, as you said. And we have worked intensively and systematically in these fields for a long time. And we have identified through the years a lot of victims for human trafficking in prostitution and in the labor. My longest experience is from the prostitution area, and I will use the Nordic model, or it's called, the law that prohibits the purchase of sexual service, as an example that national laws and politics not always have the effect it's supposed to have. And my focus here is to question whether one of the measures implemented to reduce or counteract the extent of human trafficking by Norway and in many other countries now have had the desired effect, and whether the human rights of possible victims are safeguarded enough. In Norway, the law prohibiting the purchase of sexual services which was introduced in 2009, had 4 goals. Firstly, to reduce the total market. Secondly, reduce the number of purchases of sexual services. And thirdly, change attitudes among young men in particular. And fourth, reduce human trafficking. And the law is often called the sex purchase law. There has generally been a debate as to whether the law has achieved these goals. And my focus here is linked to the last goal. Has the law prevented human trafficking, or has it reduced the extent of human trafficking? And those who have argued that the law has reduced human trafficking often argue along 2 lines. First, when the market becomes smaller, the extent of human trafficking also becomes smaller. And secondly, when it has been prohibited to buy sexual services, those who sell sexual services, including those who are exposed to human trafficking, have their positions strengthened in relation to those who buy sexual services. Those who sell can report the customer to the police if they are subjected to abuse, exploitation, or trafficking. And this is because it's legal to sell sexual services, but not to buy them. But we have to question this. Is it difficult to measure the extent of the prostitution market? Now, the sale of sexual services takes place on many different platforms, ranging from pure escort sites to a multitude of apps and websites that are initially designed for other purposes, such as dating apps. It is nevertheless natural to think that the Sex Purchase Act has reduced and not increased the market. But we know very little about the subgroups of the market, for example, the extent of human trafficking. And on this, we just have to speculate. So has the position for those who are selling sex been strengthened as a result of the customer being criminalized? This is a claim that has been asserted with weight, but which, in my view, is more a theoretical construct than a reality. When the Sex Purchase Act was introduced, there was a major focus on monitoring the prostitution environment with the intention to identifying those who buy sex and punish them with large fines. The prostitution scene in the street was monitored with large police resources. People selling sex via escort sites were contacted by the police, posing as customers. The police then visited the apartments or hotels in order to find the customers. And the way the police followed and still continue to follow the Sex Purchase Act means that there was a very strained relationship between those who sold sex and the police. The people selling sex felt monitored, they lost income, and had mobile phone seized so that the police could track down more customers on their contact list. The monitoring of those who sell sexual services must be said to be in direct conflict with the principle 24 of the guiding principles we heard about earlier. To succeed with preventing human trafficking, it is essential to cooperate with those who are possible victims, both to help them and for them to report the traffickers to the police. In Norway, the climate between those who are possible victims and the police is worse than before the Sex Purchase Act. And as a result of that, we are identifying fewer persons. So my conclusion is therefore that the monitoring approach is, as a consequence of the Sex Purchase Act, does not reduce or counteract the extent of human trafficking. It could be the opposite.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. We are going to further discuss that, but it's important, you know, to know from somebody who has to work with it, you know, and knows what's going on. So thank you very much for the moment. I'll come back to that. I would now like maybe continue with Gabriella Bottani. She is a sister, a religious sister, and the former coordinator of a network, of an anti-trafficking, a worldwide anti-trafficking network, you call it Talita Kum, and we met also on a project, you know, in the MENA region in Lebanon, you know, where Talita Kum worked with Muslim women. I mean, this was impressive, you know, what they did there. But what we probably want to hear from you is a bit more broader. You for many years, you know, you worked in Brazil, you have experience there, and your quote is quite optimistic, you know. Maybe we don't share that, but it's good to have people, you know, who see it in this optimistic way. You said a society free of human trafficking and all forms of exploitation is possible. Transforming mindsets and behaviors is fundamental in achieving this. Yeah? So we would like to hear on prevention, you know, and in preparation of this meeting, we also said, well, prevention starts a long time before something is happened, you know, and prevention is also needed after So let us see how you handle this topic. Please, Gabriela, you have the word.
Thank you, Helga, for bringing the topic of prevention into discussion, because I think it is important to help us to widen also the perspective of anti-trafficking from a criminalization, law enforcement perspective into really a social issue. And often we forget that we are all actors in this field of anti-trafficking, like it was also mentioned before. And my expertise started in Amazonia and Fortaleza, so not in European context. And again, I have learned to be optimistic, not optimistic, full of hope, because in this time of increasing of vulnerabilities and crises and multiple crises, we are also facing a loss of the human rights approach. And this is something we need really to go back. So prevention, what is then in this perspective of reducing demand? I have some concern on that, because I think that we need to work on making people responsible, and responsibility is to be aware of the consequences of our actions. And often we forget that. But we need also to have a kind to envision something, and this is the human rights perspective. We can't lose that. If we lose that, we get lost. On the other side, according to my experience working with at-risk group and survivors, the difficulties we are facing is how we can keep the center to the victim and to the person at risk in this perspective of reducing the demand. That the risk is that we decentralize the perspective and we lose what it is important, how we can really address the people at risk of being trafficked and the communities. Something that I think we need to deepen more is which are the consequences of human trafficking, not only in, I do not like more this definition, but try to understand in the destination countries, so Europe, but which is the impact of trafficking in the source countries where people are recruited, like in the area of Amazonia, or in the area we spoke before about Albania or Nigeria, which is the impact. And often we see that in many places, what the person perceives, the perception is an improving, a social improving of the reality. Then we go back and to say the real perspective of working in prevention is to provide a real alternative to people. Because if they get trafficked, it's because they need work and they accept to start their journey dreaming a better perspective of life. This is, I think, at least for me, it was the most challenging experiences in Brazil, because often we are able to offer to a kind of exploitation another form of exploitation, like do not be exploited in sexual market or in prostitution. But I will never forget some of the most beautiful expression, like I would like to quote two. One, it was, oh, beautiful, what you are offering me to work 16 to 18 hours a day cleaning up. And I am earning very few money. Now I get much more money. And of course, this is not true. This is, let me say, a kind of illusion, because the money, it was not for her, but it was for the exploitative system. And the other one was, you offer me to enter in your word from the door of the servant. I would like to enter with you in the front door of your word. So when we are speaking in anti-trafficking, we are really, and we mentioned that today, in a huge, complex way of thinking our world. And for this reason, we need to be able to dream something different. And now that we are facing such amazing crisis, I think that more than before, we are called to do that. That is my experience.
Thank you very much. Yeah? Thank you very much for these aspects of the topic we are discussing. So, and last but not least, I asked Daya Wenke. She is an independent researcher and policy analyst, mainly on the rights of the child, but also on trafficking in general. I may say that she was one of the first persons to work with me, you know, already in the Stability Pact, so it's ages ago. But we can see she has remained on that and specialized, you know, in things which made her a real expert. And I would like to repeat what she quoted. There is broad consensus on human rights principles. I'm not so sure even about that, but let's say, yeah, there's broad consensus on human rights principles, but unless we learn to implement, they risk being mere lip service. I would like, and this is quite interesting, and maybe you can elaborate on that a bit, I would like to see a paradigm shift from protection system to prevention system. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Helga, and thank you for having me today. It's been so rich and interesting this morning. I'll try and continue, you know, making the connections also to what previous speakers have said and trying to organize my thoughts into this complexity. I would like to start off with a more general comments and then, if time allows, add a concrete example. Of course, when we speak about demand, and I would speak now specifically about child trafficking, as this is mainly the rights of the child, the implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is my main field of work. So it is clear that there is a slightly different approach here to demand, which is on the larger terms less controversial, as at least when we approach the question from international standards, it is very clear that exploitation of children is prohibited by international and European standards in any form and any context. I would just like to recognize that if we look at specific cases and scenarios, we can also even discuss this, but I think we should not get into this now. I would like to start off, as you said, Helga, with a reflection on the mainstream response to child trafficking, which is a protection response, right? There is at the level of national governments, but also in the transnational governance system of the United Nations, European Union, Council of Europe, the common discussion of a child protection systems approach to child trafficking. And I would just like to underline that we do have significant evidence that shows that this is maybe not the best approach and is also not necessarily working in practice. And I would like to recall two studies that I did, and they already date back now 10, 12 years. One study was commissioned by the National Committees for UNICEF of the Nordic countries, and I carried that out with the Innocenti Research Center of UNICEF. And another study I repeated then with the same approach in the European, southern European countries. So this is really a European experience, but I would like to suggest that it may have a global relevance. What I did with these studies is to analyze national responses to child trafficking from a perspective that is based on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to understand how far they are really in accordance with a child rights-based approach. And what emerged is a very important lesson learned, that the protection approach is the main approach in addressing child trafficking. And this just does not work, because many children are not interested in what the protection system is offered, and there are many reasons for this. It's often patronizing. It's often really focused on perceiving the child victims of trafficking only as vulnerable victims, rather than considering also their own life projects, their own agency, their circumstances of life, their context. And it often comes in just too late, right? You need to be recognized as a victim of trafficking in order to get access to this protection. And even if we analyze these cases where children are actually identified as victims of trafficking, only very few succeed to be recognized as victims and receive meaningful assistance. In fact, there is research that shows that many court proceedings on child trafficking eventually end because there's no conviction of the perpetrators and the case is just dropped, and no one knows what happens to these children. So this is a very strange, contradictory approach, and in one way there is a focus on a protection approach, but even that protection approach doesn't work out. And speaking to practitioners who work as, you know, in shelters, in the assistance services with child victims of trafficking, they say the children who are willing to cooperate with us, we usually manage to, you know, to help them, to support them. But as soon as there are threats involved, threats against a child, against a family at home, we are lacking the means. So we lose the children because they go back to the traffickers. So this is a strange dichotomy where a protection approach has been designed and is proposed by the international community, by the national governments, but in practice it fails. Now, what emerged from these studies that really worked with a child rights-based approach, guided by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is the lesson learned that the Convention is really an important guidance document. It can almost have a programmatic nature and guide national governments and state actors in developing responses. And now, I would like to come back from this discussion briefly to the idea of a prevention system. What could that mean, really, right? And I really appreciate the discussion you've had in the morning. It is very difficult to discuss this for trafficking in human beings. I would, however, challenge you, and please challenge me on this, to suggest that the Convention is a guide for a prevention system. And I unfortunately don't see much recognition of this. When I propose this approach, I've been challenged also by UN, United Nations officials saying, isn't that too simple? If you're saying you need to implement, right, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and then I'm not claiming that would solve everything, but it could really significantly advance prevention and also enhance the protection. And unfortunately, we don't know how to implement. So it's not that simple at all. So I'm advocating a lot, not only for a prevention system based on the on a lot of much more attention to strengthening the capability of states and of governments to implement human rights in practice. And in order to achieve this, we do need an implementation science. I don't understand how come we have international and European human rights standards since Mike, the principles you developed, and congratulations, I think they are excellent. In a nutshell, I think they are very short for the amount of substance you managed to convey with these principles. These are human rights standards, and in Europe we have them for how many years? 70 years, the European Convention. We are not implementing them. And we don't discuss how to implement them. So, of course, in order to learn how to implement, we need an implementation science, and that just does not exist. So this is a major gap. I think we do need more attention on the capability to implement, and here comes another problem, because if I try to advocate for this, there are no actors who would take this on, because in governments you don't have the one institution or the responsible actors who are responsible for the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Usually that theme of child rights is packed into, you may have ministries of children in only a few countries, usually it's ministries for families and social affairs, and what do? They promote a protection approach, right? So that is not the implementation of the rights of the child, that is just a protection approach, it's just one small little item. And in consequence, we find that the issues under the Convention on the Rights of the Child are split up in different ministries at the transnational governance level. It's split up in different institutions of the EU, in different UN agencies. UNICEF will not work on the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child because they always have, that's based on an international agreement, and a director who is a citizen of the United States. So they will not promote the implementation of the Convention. UNODC, of course, doesn't have a mandate to promote the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. OHCHR says it's not our business, it should be UNICEF doing this. So there's no ownership of pushing forward a new momentum for promoting the implementation of human rights standards. And yeah, this is my main point really that I would like to make. I think we need an implementation science really studying how this can work in practice. This will not solve everything, but it will really reduce significantly the vulnerabilities and also strengthen up protection as responses by ensuring they are integrated into a broader human rights-based approach. And Helga, I now have talked a lot. I don't know if there's time to add further examples. I might maybe pass back to
discussion. Maybe I can, thank you very much for that. Maybe I would, anyway, we are late, but nevertheless, it's important to discuss that, Amang, I can imagine that you have things to add and ask, but please, it's also open to everybody, to comment and to ask also, not only questions, but just to comment on the issue and to contribute to the discussion. I imagine Susanne must have certain questions to, perhaps to Olaf or so, I don't know, but also others, please, it's open, please. I need somebody, or could you help me with the micro? Wait a moment, we have it. No, don't keep yours, keep yours.
No, but I have mine.
We have that. You have that, okay.
Thank you very much. Does it work? Yes. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Helga, for organizing this perfect and super interesting event. My name is Irena Ferčíková-Konečná. I have been attending this event for many years, and I always enjoy. Currently, I am a consultant of European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance, so I also very much appreciate the Olaf's contribution to this debate, because our organization is working with sex workers collectives, working also on the issues of exploitation in the sex industry. Basically what I would like to say, because the discussion is about prevention, about meaningful prevention, and I really like the debate around it, and I would like to point out to one thing, and there were a few things, I have my notes over there, what Kirill said about the contextualized kind of prevention. Our organization is working also on community research, which means that we are working with our members in a way that we would like to see the nuanced situation of how exploitation exactly looks like in the sex industry, what our members are doing, and what are actually the measures. And we are struggling a lot to bring this knowledge onto the table of the anti-trafficking agenda. And and I already maybe mentioned it last time, but unlike the UN agencies working on HIV health prevention, in which the key principle in successful policies is the involvement, a meaningful involvement of key communities. In the area of addressing trafficking in human beings, we see a huge gap where people who are affected are seen as those vulnerable in need to be rescued, not consulted, not meaningfully included. And like what I really like working with sex workers communities is to listening the debates about like what's going on, what are the situations. Currently, sex workers are very much discussing the issue of online work is a really big thing for them. And I wish them to sit in the panel and to really open and discuss the challenges they face in the online space. And I'm not going to reproduce it here, but I really believe that the anti-trafficking debate would really benefit from these discussions, because they are really going into the point. And I still believe that the point the anti-trafficking stakeholders are like discussing, especially prevention, is missing. Like, let's invite the communities. I know that it's difficult because the communities at risk of trafficking are those who are undocumented. So they are not required to be here because they could be at risk of being detained, deported, and we would probably be maybe blamed for facilitating illegal migration. But I mean, like, what I see as key is inclusion of the communities affected, and unless we will be able to do it, we will not find feasible solutions.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. You're right. This is true and should be done much more than we do it. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. Others. Please, Christina Kangaspunta and Evelyn, then Evelyn. Maybe you come up here because they just show me come up here, yeah, this is good. Yeah. Just so then they have the...
I'm not
No.
that much. I mean, I just have some simple...
The people at the live stream can also see. You know,
okay, very good, yeah, fine. So one thing which I wanted to say, and specifically after the what I heard just the last speaker who said just about the involving different communities and those who are involved, I think we are a little bit in a situation that we are sort of like captured in this kind of an idea that the trafficking would go away, that it would disappear if we just prevent different types of things, then it will stop, like it was like abolition of slavery, that we compare trafficking with this kind of situation, which is very, very much different. And as I said previously, I think that it doesn't go away. I'm sorry to say. I'm not very optimistic on that. And that's why I think we would need to focus the prevention and our activities to admit that yes, there is trafficking, but there is also very much harm which it is introducing or causing, and that's why we would need to reduce the harm, so we would need to go to harm reduction. This is a little bit the same discussion as with drugs, and I know that there is a big opposition of sort of like admitting that trafficking is not going away and that we can go to harm reduction, but I'm actually thinking that this would be the way to go. But I also have a question to Olaf. Thank you very much for a very interesting introduction or explanation of the situation in Norway. My question is, you were speaking that the aim of the legislation was to reduce different types of things like prostitution and trafficking. So what does this reduce mean? Is it that reduction is enough if it is one person? Or where is the limit for reduction? Or was it really aimed to reduce prostitution and trafficking to zero? I mean, I'm just sort of like curious to understand what is this reducing mean? What does it mean? And the other question is that obviously when you are criminalizing clients, those who are selling sex, they lose their income. So what was planned to sort of like to replace this lost income to the sex workers? Was there some kind of a plan to do something about this situation, or to give more sort of possibilities for actually staying alive? So yeah, these were my questions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
good. Please, you could immediately
Well, the Nordic model has, in Norway, was introduced in 2009, and then we had a lot of Nigerian women in the street, prostitution. So, and there was a big debate of we should introduce the law or not. So I think the goal to reduce human trafficking were more a tactical, political view than and I think the other goals was more important. And Sweden introduced the law in 1999, for example, and there was no debate about human trafficking regarded to the law in Sweden. So I think, yeah, again, it was more political right. One of the arguments, this was a big debate, and the different parties were very divided. So, I think it's among those who worked with human trafficking, this was not the argument we listened to at all. It was a fake argument, I think. When the law was introduced, there was a lot of plans for how to help the victims. But the main problem is that it is a big mismatch between what the government offered as protection and help, and what, if you asked those who were victims, wanted. Because if you listen to those who are victims, they will say they need a safe place to stay. They will need legal assistance, not just to the case of human trafficking, because they are often involved in other cases because they live in a very difficult situation and have also other problems just to survive. They needed psychological following up. And most of all, they wanted income because many are having children and supporting family in the home country, and they wanted a resident permit, permanent resident permit in the country they were identified in, and. I think that's the main problem with the help programs in Norway. That is, it's not predictable. You don't know what happens if you are being identified, and often you are transported to back home, or through the Dublin Convention back to the country where often the traffickers are settled. So they said it was they had these programs to swallow the pill, is often said, to swallow the law. Mm.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. First Evelyn, and then.
Now I changed my questions. After your statement, I changed my question, and I think now you made it really obvious with that combination that the objectives of these laws and the result of the law don't fit to each other. And I really would like to continue what you said, Christina, because what is the compensation for the sex worker due to the reduce of the labor, of the working field for them? So there is no idea on that. And as you said, and it's not critics on you, it's critics on the system. It is like, as you said, the idea was to reduce trafficking. So the logic implementation of when you reduce trafficking is not a victim support system. Because then if you reduce trafficking, you don't need a victim support system because there are no victims anymore. You know what I mean? Eh? So the logic would be to include compensation for sex workers for the next 10 years or something like that. Now, if we have really measures how we estimate when a change of law is works, then we could say, okay, we changed the law, and the idea is to change the attitude of the people. And how long does it last to change the attitude? So we assume, I don't know. I don't know if any law ever was measured like that. How long? Maybe we can take in consideration. This is now an idea. We have a law in Austria which is against violence against in the domestic field. It was implemented in '98, and nobody ever assumed that this law will reduce domestic violence at the beginning, but it will make it more visible, and there will be more help. We had figures last year which increased. So 98 till 21, it was an increase. So, but if you have in a law, and this is also a law which intends to change the attitude. It intends to change the attitude and says violence in the private sphere is not acceptable in a society we are living on. Therefore, we implement measures. Okay. I had, and therefore, like for me, it is the changing the attitude in the demand debate is interesting. But how do we measure that the attitude is changed towards all these different fields? And I was always saying, like, please take in consideration that we have 2 crimes defined in the EU directive where I question you and us, where's the demand? There's begging. Where's the demand for begging? So in this frame of, because if we take the frame of that the client of a sex worker is that one who demands, then it means that this person who is giving money has the demand on begging. So this is the same logic. I assume nobody has a demand on giving money. And the same thing is for criminal activities. So who is the client of criminal activities? The person where the things were stolen from? No demand on criminal activities. So there is a missing logic, because if we have the same crime and we all agree on that this is the same crime, exploitation for whatever, then the system should be the same. Because if it's not the same, we don't have the same crime. And then we have like to change the idea, what is human trafficking? And I think this is what we have to have in mind to take these examples, that this debate doesn't work around that. And the third question, sorry, it was so interesting, this changing the attitude. So it means via, again, so we're in a world where we say that there's gender discrimination. Very often we are still not there to understand that gender discrimination is not because there's more women affected, or there's more men affected, or there are no men in there. This is not the idea. We don't count, because it doesn't work. So, but again, in this field, it's perceived that the majority of sex workers are female, and the majorities of the clients are male. And therefore, we save the women due to the changes of the attitudes of the men. So, I hope you follow my idea. And that means, again, it's on the burden of the woman to change the men. So we have, the idea is that via this demand debate in this field, that there's this idea, we want new men. Because their attitude has to be changed, so we want new men. But it works like that the working field of women are reduced, no idea of compensation. For that, a missing income, and then the attitude of the men are changed. Thank you.
Susanne, and then Gabriela.
Yeah, just thought to react to a couple of things. First of all, she's right, which is demand with certain forms. It's very, very unclear. When we were part of the ICMPD study in 2014 to 2017, we also saw, and I think she revealed already about how different people look at the issue of demand. For example, for the law enforcement, any actions they do is addressing demand, because they even see prevention activities to stop traffickers as a demand reduction. So it's already funny how people interpret it. Secondly, what I always think is surprising, that demand is so quoted negatively, while generally you would say if there is a demand, a large demand for iPhones, for example, why doesn't it lead, and there's so much profit make, why doesn't it lead to better working rights and more income for the workers? So it's not only the demand, there's something else happening, and we strict to look too much narrowly at the issue of demand, but we forget about all the other factors that influence. Secondly, about the impact assessment. We were joking also a little bit. In the Netherlands, is the country where I come from, is always compared with Sweden because of the Nordic model and the Dutch model. Sweden very often tend to say we have such a low amount of figures of trafficking, and that's why we see that our model is very impactful. In the Netherlands, over the last years, the figures of identification and reported trafficked persons has decreased enormously. We all are very concerned and worried, and all the NGOs are saying all the time, oh, what's happening? Why don't we see them? We are very much worried. But I said just recently to the new national rapporteur on the Netherlands, maybe we should change it. Maybe we should say we are very effective, because we've never had such a low number. And then we can compete with the Swedes and say we are actually doing quite well, because look at the low amounts of identification figures. So it would be too simple to say that a low number of identification means that there is a clear impact. So that's also what we have to look much more critically at how we measure the impact. And then lastly, as for demand, and I think I very much also agreed with you, we should really put human rights much more forefront, but we should go out of our anti-trafficking bubble, because we always try to say once people are trafficked, we should put their rights central, and then we should look at them. And we have all these gender policies and all this kind of equality policies nowadays, but it's not working. We should do that before. Last week I heard again, like the income in Moldova, the monthly income is €150 a month. I mean, how can we even say that, we have equal rights even within the EU? I mean, if there's such an enormous amount of difference between what people's income is, how people's life circumstances is, and then, of course, the people who come in from other countries that are even poorer, and Christina said it already, poverty was a major reason. I think we should stop, and we should really say, let's be much more consistent. If we want to address human trafficking, we really have to look at the broader picture and step out of our small bubble of doing anti-trafficking work, because then we will never have any clear impact.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anyway, but the problem really is that what we also try to do, is to encourage the right political will to go in this direction. But politicians very often like simplistic answers. Yeah, it's easier. Then they can say, well, we have done something. I have the impression quite often with this so-called Nordic model, because I was there, 20 years ago, or even more, in Sweden, it was just, no, we just, we do it, they at that time already, didn't listen to any argument, not even discuss it, but this was the idea, and we go for it. And this is, but this is not only typical for Sweden, but also for others very often, and that's really a bit a problem. But now, Gabriela, please.
It's really a complex reality. If I go back to my experience, and I see how important it is to provide compensation, to provide staying visa, working visa, and providing really an opportunity for a changing of life and giving the opportunity for the people. And it requires a deep mentality change for the welcoming society, but for everybody. And it's becoming always much more difficult. What you said, Olaf, before is the classic. We try to solve human trafficking, moving the problem from Norway to Italy and from Italy to Libya, and we know how this is going through. And it is expression of a non-culture. I can't call that culture. It is a non-culture that is really entering in our daily life and more and more. We need to go back in implementation of the law, but we need also, there is a state commitment, but we do not have to forget that we as civil society, we belong also to the state. And we need to move involving leaders, more and more people. They may really support a change in education at all levels. If not, we are working on theory, and according to my experience at the grassroots, it's very easy to make one good idea an ideology, and then we miss the connection with the reality. And we really put the burden on the people that they are still suffering discrimination. Are they women, indigenous, undocumented migrants? This is not the matter, but this is the sad consequence of that. I am not optimistic too, so we do not have a solution, but I can't stay with that. I am very uncomfortable with this. And strengthening open dialogue among all the actors, I think, looking at the reality, honestly, I think that it is the only way we can go forward.
Thank you very much. This is where we try a bit, but we also realize that's quite difficult, yeah? But at least this is really what we try to do. So we run out of time completely, but nevertheless, I would like to ask, is there one short comment by Mike, by Noemi, or by Roger? If not, you're not forced to, but if you feel compelled to, yeah? Okay? No? Okay. So then, thank you very much for this panel. So, we will continue, yeah, at least at latest next year, you know, maybe even earlier. So thank you very much to everybody. And we make a quick change, please. We start immediately. I mean, you can go out and have your drink, etc. But we would immediately continue with the third section, which will be on the principle of non-discrimination. And again, we start with a short introduction, have two commentators, and then we would have the panel. So thank you very much. Ask